November 1st, 1943. 03:42 hours. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched in the humid darkness of the jungle, listening. After 18 months fighting across the Pacific, he learned to identify every sound. The rustle of palm fronds in the wind, the calls of jungle birds at dawn, the scurrying of rats through the undergrowth, the distant crash of waves on coral beaches. Every sound had meaning. Every sound told a story. And the sound he was hearing now told a story that made his blood run cold. Engines. Hundreds of engines. Not the high-pitched whine of Japanese diesel engines. Not the distinctive rumble of Japanese trucks. These were deeper, throatier, more powerful American engines. And they weren't just a few vehicles. This was a mechanized army. He'd heard similar sounds at Guadalcanal before the Japanese evacuation. He'd heard them at New Georgia when American forces had overrun Japanese positions with overwhelming firepower. But this was different. This was louder. This was more. This was everything. Yamamoto turned to his platoon leader, Lieutenant Akira Matsuda. The lieutenant was young, fresh from Japan, hadn't yet learned to read the jungle the way veterans like Yamamoto had. "Sir, we need to withdraw immediately." Matsuda frowned. "We have orders to hold this position. The American landing is not expected for another 2 days. Intelligence says they are still gathering forces at Guadalcanal." Yamamoto shook his head. "Intelligence is wrong, sir. Those are American vehicles. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They're not gathering at Guadalcanal. They're already here. And if we can hear them from 3 kilometers away, it means they don't care that we know they're coming. It means they have so many vehicles, so many men, so much firepower, that our knowing doesn't matter. We cannot stop what is coming. We need to withdraw now or we will die here." This is that story. The story of how one Japanese soldier heard the sound of American mechanization and understood in that instant that Japan had already lost the Pacific War. Not lost this battle, not lost this island, lost everything. Because the sound he heard wasn't just engines. It was American industrial power made audible. It was the arsenal of democracy turned into a physical force. It was the sound of a nation that could build 10,000 trucks, ship them across the largest ocean, land them on a hostile beach, and use them to crush Japanese resistance through sheer weight of material. The sound wasn't just loud. It was mathematically impossible for Japan to defeat, and Sergeant Yamamoto knew it the moment he heard it. The American invasion of Bougainville was designated Operation Cherry Blossom. It was planned as a demonstration of American capability to conduct amphibious operations with overwhelming force. The 3rd Marine Division would land at Cape Torquena. The 37th Infantry Division would follow. Together they would establish a beachhead, build an airfield, and use Bougainville as a base to neutralize the massive Japanese base at Rabaul without directly assaulting it. This was the strategy of island hopping made real. Bypass Japanese strongpoints. Let them wither while American forces advanced. But the scale of American logistics supporting this operation was what made it revolutionary. Previous Pacific operations had been exercises in scarcity. Commanders fought for every ship, every truck, every gallon of fuel. Guadalcanal had been won partly because Japanese logistics were worse than American logistics, not because American logistics were good. But by late 1943, American industrial production had reached levels that transformed Pacific warfare. Scarcity was over. Abundance had arrived. The numbers supporting the Bougainville invasion defied Japanese comprehension. The landing force included approximately 14,000 Marines in the initial assault, with 20,000 more troops to follow. But troops were just the beginning. The support vehicles numbered over 2,000. Jeeps, trucks, bulldozers, cranes, amphibious vehicles, command cars, ambulances, tank haulers. Every type of vehicle needed to support a modern mechanized force. And every one of those vehicles had been built in America, loaded on ships in America, transported 7,000 miles across the world's largest ocean, and was about to be landed on a hostile beach. To Japanese forces on Bougainville, this was incomprehensible. The entire Japanese garrison on the island numbered approximately 40,000 troops, but possessed perhaps 200 vehicles total. Most Japanese supplies were moved by hand. Soldiers carried ammunition on their backs. Artillery was pulled by soldiers, not vehicles. This wasn't by choice. This was all Japan could provide. Their industrial capacity couldn't produce vehicles in the quantities needed. Their shipping couldn't transport them even if they existed. Their logistics system couldn't maintain them if they arrived. The Americans weren't just mechanized, they were hyper-mechanized. They had more vehicles than many armies had soldiers. They had trucks to carry supplies, trucks to carry the troops, trucks to carry fuel for the other trucks. They had redundancy upon redundancy. If a vehicle broke down, 3 more were available. If supplies ran short, more were already being unloaded from ships offshore. The American system wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed for overwhelming abundance that made efficiency irrelevant. Yamamoto had witnessed this abundance firsthand at Guadalcanal. He'd been a part of the garrison that held Henderson Field before the Marines took it. After the American landing, he had watched from the jungle as supplies poured onto the beaches. Mountains of crates, forests of fuel drums, endless convoys of vehicles moving supplies forward. The Americans didn't ration. They didn't conserve. They used supplies with a profligacy that shocked Japanese observers. Empty ration cans were thrown away rather than reused. Damaged equipment was abandoned rather than repaired. Fuel was used freely without concern for conservation. This wastefulness was actually a strength. It meant the Americans never worried about running out. They could fire artillery without calculating whether they'd have shells tomorrow. They could use vehicles without fearing they couldn't be replaced. They could operate knowing that the supply pipeline from America was so robust that nothing they did at the front would exhaust it. This psychological advantage was as important as the material advantage. American soldiers fought knowing they were backed by unlimited resources. Japanese soldiers fought knowing every bullet needed to count because there weren't many more bullets coming. The sound Yamamoto heard on November 1st, 1943, was this abundance made audible. Hundreds of vehicles idling before the assault, bulldozers that would clear beaches, trucks that would haul supplies, amphibious tractors that would carry troops through the surf, command vehicles with radios that would coordinate the operation, fuel trucks that would keep everything else running, ambulances that would evacuate wounded. Each vehicle represented American industrial capacity. Together, they represented American power at a scale Japan couldn't match. Matsuda didn't believe Yamamoto initially. How could the Americans have landed so many vehicles already? The invasion hadn't officially started. Intelligence says American forces are still gathering at Guadalcanal. The sound had to be exaggerated by the jungle, or perhaps it was a small American patrol that sounded larger than it was. This was wishful thinking. Matsuda wanted to believe Japanese intelligence was correct. Wanted to believe he had 2 more days to prepare. Wanted to believe the situation was manageable. Yamamoto knew better. He learned to trust his senses over intelligence reports. Intelligence told comfortable lies. The jungle told uncomfortable truths. And the truth was that an overwhelming American force was already ashore and preparing to attack. He checked his rifle. Type 38 bolt action. 5 rounds in the magazine. He had 2 more 5-round clips in his pouches, 15 rounds total. Against thousands of Americans with semi-automatic rifles, unlimited ammunition, and artillery support, 15 rounds meant nothing. The comparison between Japanese and American infantry equipment revealed the resource gap. Yamamoto's Type 38 rifle was reliable and accurate, but required manual bolt operation between shots. Rate of fire was perhaps 15 rounds per minute for a skilled rifleman. An American rifleman with an M1 Garand could fire 40 rounds per minute semi-automatically. One American rifleman had more than twice the firepower of one Japanese rifleman. A 12-man American squad had more firepower than a 30-man Japanese platoon. But the firepower gap was even worse when you added support weapons. American infantry squads had Browning automatic rifles, portable light machine guns that provided suppressive fire. American platoons had 60mm mortars that could drop high explosive rounds on target within minutes. American companies had machine gun sections with water-cooled Brownings that could fire continuously for hours. American battalions had 81mm mortars, recoilless rifles, and attached artillery support. The firepower pyramid expanded at every level. Japanese infantry had less at every level. Squads had one light machine gun if they were lucky. Platoons might have a grenade launcher. Companies sometimes had heavy machine guns, but often lacked ammunition. Battalion-level support was minimal. Japanese artillery was scarce, and ammunition rationed. The firepower differential meant American infantry could attack Japanese positions with overwhelming suppressive fire, while Japanese infantry could only return sporadic shots. The vehicle gap magnified this disparity further. American infantry rolled to battle in trucks. They arrived fresh, organized, with full ammunition loads. Japanese infantry walked. They arrived tired, strung out, having consumed ammunition during approach. American wounded were evacuated in ambulances
to field hospitals with surgery capability. Japanese wounded were carried by comrades or left behind. American supplies moved forward in trucks continuously. Japanese supplies moved forward on soldiers' backs intermittently. This wasn't just material advantage. This was systemic advantage at every level. The American way of war was mechanized, mobile, and supplied at rates that made Japanese resistance mathematically unsustainable. Even when Japanese forces achieved local tactical success, they couldn't sustain it because they lacked the logistics to exploit success. American forces could absorb local tactical defeats because their logistics allowed them to bring up reinforcements and supplies faster than Japanese forces could exploit advantages. At 06:15 hours on November 1st, the American bombardment began. Naval guns from offshore cruisers and destroyers poured shells into Japanese beach positions. The volume of fire was unprecedented in Yamamoto's experience. He'd seen naval bombardment at Guadalcanal. This was worse, much worse. The Americans weren't conserving ammunition. They were saturating Japanese positions with high explosive and white phosphorus. Trees exploded. The ground shook continuously. The sound was so loud that communication was impossible. You couldn't hear shouting over the bombardment. You could only huddle in your foxhole and pray. The bombardment lasted for 90 minutes. 90 minutes of continuous fire. American gunners expended thousands of rounds, more ammunition in 90 minutes than Japanese shore batteries had fired in the entire Guadalcanal campaign. This profligacy represented American logistics at its most overwhelming. American logistics didn't say, conserve ammunition for tomorrow's battle. American logistics said, use everything today because more arrives tomorrow.
When the bombardment lifted, Yamamoto emerged from his shattered position to see amphibious vehicles approaching the beach. These weren't landing craft that stopped at the waterline and disgorged troops into the surf. These were amphibious tractors that drove straight out of the ocean and onto the beach, protected by armor, carrying troops and supplies directly to the fight. He'd seen these at Tower War reports, but seeing them in person was different. They represented technological capability Japan couldn't match. Japan had no amphibious vehicles. Japanese troops landed from conventional boats and waded ashore under fire. Americans rode ashore in armored vehicles. The disparity continued after the landing. Within hours, American engineers had established supply dumps on the beach. Within a day, they were building roads inland. Within 3 days, they were constructing an airfield. The speed was impossible by Japanese standards. Japanese engineers might take weeks to build what American engineers completed in days. The difference was mechanization. American engineers had bulldozers, graders, rollers, trucks. They could move earth at rates that manual labor couldn't approach. Sergeant Yamamoto and the survivors of his platoon withdrew into the jungle interior. Lieutenant Matsuda had been killed in the bombardment. Of the 43 men in the platoon, 19 survived to the first day. They had no communications with higher command. They had limited ammunition.
They had no food supplies beyond what they carried. They were cut off, surrounded by an American force that outnumbered them completely and outsupplied them infinitely. Their mission was no longer to hold positions. Their mission had become survival. Over the next weeks, Yamamoto witnessed American construction capability transform Bougainville. From jungle hilltops, he watched bulldozers clear jungle for the airfield. He watched trucks haul rock and coral for runway construction. He watched as the Americans built what would become one of the Pacific's major air bases in less than 6 weeks. The speed defied belief. Japanese forces had occupied Bougainville for over a year and built minimal infrastructure. Americans arrived and built a complete airbase in 6 weeks. The secret was mechanization combined with American construction methods. The Seabees, Navy construction battalions, used prefabricated components whenever possible. Runway matting came in sections that could be laid quickly. Buildings came in kits that could be assembled rapidly. Fuel storage came in bladders that could be rolled out and filled. Everything was designed for rapid deployment and construction using mechanical equipment operated by trained workers. Japanese construction used manual labor and improvisation. Soldiers built fortifications by hand. Engineers constructed facilities using local materials and basic tools. This worked for defensive positions. It failed completely for large-scale construction projects. An American construction battalion with equipment could build in a week what a Japanese regiment with hand tools would need months to complete. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. They'd been told they were fighting to defend Japanese territory and honor. Instead, they were watching Americans build an airfield that would bomb Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. They'd been told Japanese spirit would overcome American material. Instead, American material was so overwhelming that spirit was irrelevant. They'd been told to hold positions to the death. Instead, they were hiding in the jungle, watching Americans build infrastructure that would last for decades. Yamamoto survived on Bougainville for 7 months. His group of survivors dwindled from 19 to 7 to finally 3. They didn't die in combat. They died from disease, malnutrition, and infections that couldn't be treated without medical supplies. The Americans occasionally sent patrols into the interior, but mostly ignored isolated Japanese survivors. The Americans didn't need to hunt down every Japanese soldier. They just needed to control the airfield and keep positions. Isolated Japanese soldiers in the jungle posed no threat to American operations. This was another lesson in American warfare. They didn't fight for territory. They fought for operational objectives. Once they held the airfield, the rest of Bougainville didn't matter. Japanese forces could hold the jungle. Americans would hold the airfield and use it to support operations throughout the Solomons. This economy of force, focusing overwhelming power on key objectives while ignoring irrelevant territory, was enabled by American logistics. They could afford to leave large portions of islands unoccupied because they had the forces and supplies to defend the portions they did occupy. In June 1944, Yamamoto and 2 other survivors were captured when they attempted to steal food from an American supply dump. They were too weak to resist, too hungry to care. They'd heard that Americans treated prisoners well and hoped it was true. It was. They were taken to a POW camp on Guadalcanal where they received medical treatment, food, and shelter. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was stark. Americans fed prisoners, gave them medical care, housed them adequately. This wasn't altruism. This was standard American logistics. They had enough supplies that feeding prisoners didn't strain their system. During his captivity, Yamamoto had opportunities to observe American logistics operations that confirmed everything he'd suspected. At the Guadalcanal POW camp, American guards received hot meals 3 times daily. not emergency rations, not preserved food. Hot meals prepared in field kitchens and delivered to frontline positions. The meals included meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and desserts. This daily for every soldier. Guards told him that every American serviceman in the Pacific received at least 4,000 calories daily. The food supply chain from American farms to Pacific foxholes functioned so reliably that even prisoners received 2,500 calories daily.
The waste shocked Japanese prisoners. Americans threw away food that Japanese soldiers would have treasured. Half-eaten rations were discarded. Coffee poured out when soldiers received fresh cups. Bread went stale and was thrown away rather than used. This wasn't disrespect for food. This was abundance so extreme that conservation was unnecessary. American logistics produced such surpluses that waste at the end of the supply chain didn't impact operations. Yamamoto also observed American maintenance operations. Vehicles that broke down were repaired quickly or replaced. Replacement parts arrived regularly. American mechanics had tools, equipment, and manuals for every vehicle type. If a part wasn't available, it was fabricated using machine tools in mobile workshops. This maintenance capability meant American vehicles maintained high operational readiness. Most vehicles were operational most of the time. Japanese vehicles, lacking maintenance infrastructure, degraded rapidly. A Japanese vehicle that broke down often stayed broken for lack of parts or tools to repair it. The vehicle density was another revelation. American units had trucks allocated by tables of organization that specified exactly how many vehicles each unit should have. Rifle companies had jeeps, battalions had trucks, regiments had vehicle parks, divisions had hundreds of vehicles. The density was so high that most American soldiers never walked more than a few miles. They rode to battle in trucks and only walked when in direct contact with the enemy. Japanese soldiers walked everywhere, 10 miles, 20 miles, 50 miles. They walked until their feet bled, and then they kept walking because they had no vehicles. This mobility advantage meant American units could redeploy quickly to respond to threats or exploit opportunities. A Japanese division might take a week to move 20 miles by foot. An American division could move 100 miles by truck in a day. This operational mobility was a force multiplier that made American forces effectively larger than their numbers suggested. One American division could fight in multiple locations because it could move quickly. 3 Japanese divisions covering the same area couldn't concentrate forces because movement was slow. The air resupply capability demonstrated American logistics at its most impressive. American forces in remote positions received supplies by airdrop. C-47 transport aircraft would fly over and drop pallets of supplies attached to parachutes. This aerial resupply meant American forces could operate in areas that traditional logistics couldn't reach. Japanese forces in similar positions had no resupply and starved. The contrast was stark and demoralizing for Japanese prisoners who'd endured starvation while watching Americans receive supplies from the sky. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Yamamoto was repatriated to Japan. He arrived home weighing 130 pounds, 40 pounds less than when he'd enlisted. He'd lost the weight not as a POW, but as a soldier serving in the Imperial Japanese Army's logistics void. As a prisoner, he'd actually gained weight because American POW rations exceeded Japanese soldier rations. This irony wasn't lost on him. Japan fed its soldiers so poorly that becoming an American prisoner improved their nutrition. In the decades after the war, Yamamoto rarely spoke about his experiences.
But in a 1983 interview for a Japanese television documentary about Pacific War logistics, he reflected on that night on Bougainville when he'd heard the sound of American vehicles. "I knew in that moment that we'd lost. Not would lose, had already lost. The war was over. The outcome was decided. We would keep fighting for another 2 years. Hundreds of thousands more would die. But the outcome was never in doubt after that moment. Because the sound I heard was American industry made audible. You cannot defeat that with courage or tactics or fighting spirit. You cannot defeat an enemy who has so many trucks that the sound of their engines carries for kilometers. You cannot defeat an enemy whose logistics are so overwhelming that they waste more than you have." He continued, "Every Japanese soldier knew we were outgunned. We knew they had more planes, more ships, more tanks. But knowing it intellectually is different from experiencing it viscerally. That sound was visceral. That sound was the universe explaining that Japan had no path to victory. The strategy was irrelevant. The tactics were irrelevant. The fighting spirit was irrelevant. American logistics had made the outcome mathematically certain. We were fighting addition and multiplication with subtraction and division. Mathematics doesn't care about spirit. Mathematics only cares about numbers, and the numbers said Japan would lose." The interviewer asked whether different Japanese strategy might have changed the outcome. Yamamoto's response was immediate and emphatic. "No. Japan lost the day we attacked Pearl Harbor. Maybe earlier. Maybe the day someone decided Japan should go to war with America. Because Japan couldn't outproduce America in anything. We couldn't build more ships. We couldn't build more planes. We couldn't build more trucks. We couldn't even grow more food. Every material measurement favored America by factors that made competition absurd. Japan had courage. Japan had discipline. Japan had tactical skill. America had factories. In industrial warfare, factories win. Always." The legacy of American logistics in the Pacific War extends far beyond World War II. Modern American military doctrine still emphasizes logistics as foundation for operations. The ability to deploy forces globally, sustain them indefinitely, and supply them overwhelmingly remains the cornerstone of American military power. This didn't start in the Pacific, but the Pacific proved that logistic superiority could overcome every other disadvantage. American forces weren't always better trained than Japanese forces. American equipment wasn't always superior. American tactics weren't always optimal. But American logistics were so overwhelmingly superior that other factors became secondary. The sound Sergeant Yamamoto heard on Bougainville was the sound of victory. Not victory in one battle, victory in the war. Victory in all future wars where American industrial might was engaged. That sound, hundreds of vehicle engines idling in the jungle darkness, represented American power at its most fundamental. The ability to build, ship, and deploy equipment in quantities that overwhelmed opposition through sheer material weight. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It was mathematical, industrial, decisive. It was the sound of a factory nation at war. And for anyone on the receiving end of that power, it was the sound of inevitable defeat.